Assalamu alaikum students, welcome back to class. We're approaching the end of this module, but before we do, there are a few more short stories that I'm going to be discussing with you. We've been through many short stories in this module. We started off with the travelogue, we went on to short stories, and I've introduced you to different writers. If you go back to the introductory lecture that I gave you for the short stories, I pointed out to you one thing, and that was that although the short story has its origin in England, yet in the 19th century, after Walter Scott, you do not find much work being done. And it is either on the continent or across the ocean in the United States that you see a lot of work being done. And we've been discussing stories by Edgar Allan Poe and by Mark Twain, both of whom were Americans. The stories that we are currently dealing with are by the Russian writer, dramatist, thinker Anton Chekhov. And if I refer you to the introductory chapter on short story writing, you will remember that Chekhov is one of those who have had a lasting influence on short story writing. Although he was writing in the 19th century, yet even to this day, you see writers who are following the Chekhovian format. So across almost 2 centuries, you find his influence still predominates. And currently there are many different forms of short story that are being practiced and produced, but the two most important ones are the event plot story and the Chekhovian story. So with the Chekhovian story, what you see is that Chekhov, almost like a drama, builds up the action to the climax. Now, the difference between a drama and a short story would be that in the drama, after the climax, you also have the anticlimax. But in a short story, the climax is the end of the story, and it's a narrative that is complete in itself. It's a narrative that can be read in one sitting. And Chekhov specializes in short stories. He's written some beautiful short stories, but because his original language is Russian, you see that in the translated forms, the names are the same. So you have a few names which will be a little difficult to pronounce, or when I pronounce them, you might have a little difficulty in connecting the name with the printed word. But a little practice will make you perfect. And just as to us Russian names or Chinese names seem difficult to understand and comprehend and appreciate, in the same way our names are difficult for them to pronounce. We have this additional factor, and that is that in our national language and regional languages, you have certain sounds which you do not find, let's say, in the English language or in the French language. And the plus point that we enjoy is that because we can make those sounds, we can more or less pronounce any word or any sound that is not pronounced or that is not understood by speakers of English or French or even Arabic. So certain hard sounds occur in the Russian language which do not occur in other languages, but we, because we can speak Urdu, we do not have any problem in pronouncing those words and those sounds. So let me launch into the text of The Looking Glass, and once more I want to emphasize the fact that although Chekhov is writing about a Russian setup and all his stories are in the backdrop of Russia, yet you will understand what I mean when I say that they're not just about one situation. The situations that he presents, the characters that he sketches and outlines can be found anywhere in the world. And you will see what I mean, and you will understand and appreciate this when we read the text of The Looking Glass. You know what the looking glass is? It's a mirror. So this is what the text of The Looking Glass is like. New Year's Eve. New Year's Eve for Christians is a very special occasion. It follows Christmas and it is the start of a whole new year. There's a lot of celebration. There's also a lot of looking back on what you have done, whatever you have accomplished in the year, and what you plan for the new year. And the idea of the new year differs in different regions of the world. There is the, let's say, Islamic calendar, where the new year starts with Muharram, and the 1st of Muharram is the start of the new year. So that's the what we call the Hijri calendar. And then you have the Gregorian calendar, according to which New Year starts on January the 1st. Then in many parts of the world, the spring is what starts off the new year. And so people who are from Iran or the Central Asian republics, they will celebrate their new year, what they call the Nowruz, sometime in March, when you have new leaves and new buds sprouting. That's when they celebrate their New Year's. So the situation that we're talking about is the beginning of a new year. So New Year's Eve, that is the evening before the new year starts. So New Year's Eve, and he says, Nellie, the daughter of a landowner and general, a young and pretty girl dreaming day and night of being married, was sitting in her room, gazing with exhausted, half-closed eyes in the looking glass. She was pale, tense, and as motionless as the looking glass. So you know from the starting point that this is a story that is about Nellie. Anton Chekhov sketches some beautiful characters. He presents a depth to the character that you will not find in many other short story writers. So this is about Nellie, and she's young, she's pretty, she comes from a good family. Her father is a landowner and a general, and in Russia that was a big thing. But there is just one problem, and that is that she dreams of getting married. She's not married yet. She has a whole idea of what her life will be like when she gets married, but she's not married yet. And she's looking in a mirror. She's trying to see what the future holds for her. She was pale, tense, and as motionless as the looking glass. The looking glass does not move. It only reflects what you what is put in front of it. So the non-existent but apparent vista of a long, narrow corridor with endless rows of candles, the reflection of her face, her hands, of the frame. All this was already clouded in mist and merged into a boundless grey sea. The sea was undulating, gleaming, and now and then flaring crimson. So when she looks into the mirror, she sees herself, and then she sees the scene changing. She sees rows of candles. She sees her own face reflected, and it's almost like a sea of images, one after another, merging into other images, and she's totally lost in that sea of images. Looking at Nellie's motionless eyes and parted lips, one could hardly say whether she was asleep or awake, but nevertheless she was seeing. So there is a seeing that takes place even when you are sleeping. You could call it dreaming. You do it during the daytime, and it's called daydreaming. And you're not supposed to be doing that when you are listening to the lecture. So pay attention and try to involve yourself in the text of Anton Chekhov's The Looking Glass, and whatever explanation I give you, because this is the only time that you'll be able to understand it. So when she looks into the mirror, she sees only the smile and the soft, charming expression of someone's eyes. Now this is not herself. She sees eyes, and then slowly and gradually she sees a face. That face takes shape. She sees a head, a face, eyebrows, beard. So it's a bearded face that she sees. It was he, the destined one, the object of long dreams and hopes. Remember, she's young, she's pretty, she dreams of being married. And when I say that this is a situation that is universal, a lot of our girls right now, sitting, listening to this lecture, watching me, will have spent time sitting and dreaming about the time that they will get married, who they will marry, what their life will be like. So Nellie is not just a Russian girl waiting to get married. Nellie is any young girl anywhere in the world, at any point in history. She's waiting to get married. So she sees this Prince Charming, you may call him, or the person that she imagines she will be getting married to. And so she sees this face, and then she realizes that this is the person she is destined to marry. And then, of course, she sees her whole future in all its distinct details. Outside him, as on the grey background of the looking glass, all was dark, empty, meaningless. And so it was not strange that, seeing before her a handsome, gently smiling face, she was conscious of bliss. So when she sees this face, she's conscious of a calm that has come over her. All those worries, all those sleepless nights and worrying days are over, because she has found the person that she is to marry. Then she heard his voice. So from the face, she graduates on to hearing his voice. She sees herself living under the same roof. She sees herself as a married woman, living with this man, and she sees her life in very minute detail. Months and years flew by against the grey background. So, like they show in old Pakistani movies, the wheel of time moves and you come to one particular situation that the film producer and director want you to focus at. And so here also it's like the wheel of time moves. She sees months, years passing by, and then she sees herself in one particular situation, and that is one winter night she sees herself knocking at the door of Stepan Lukic, the district doctor. The old dog hoarsely and lazily barked behind the gate. The doctor's windows were in darkness. All was silence. So Nellie was there to consult with the doctor and to bring him back home with her. And she's so upset that she keeps on whispering, for God's sake, let the doctor be there. Let the doctor not be away at a time like this. So she knocks and knocks, and finally the garden gate opens, and Nellie sees the doctor's cook. And she says, is the doctor at home? And the cook says, His Honor's asleep. And she's afraid to wake him up because she's just the cook, and you know, he is the district doctor, so he has an official position, and she's just a servant. So she says that he's asleep. He only just got back from his fever patients, and he has given orders that he is not to be woken up. But Nellie scarcely heard the cook. Thrusting her aside, she rushed headlong into the doctor's house. Running through some dark and stuffy rooms, upsetting 2 or 3 chairs, she at last reached the doctor's bedroom. So when the cook says, you know, the doctor is not to be disturbed, he has been away for a long time, he has been looking at these fever patients, and now he's tired, and he's told us that we are not to wake him no matter what happens. So Nellie, because she's so upset and she's so tense and nervous, she doesn't take care of what the cook is saying, and she just pushes her to one side, and she runs into the house. She goes through some rooms, and finally she arrives at the doctor's bedroom. Stepan Lukic was lying on his bed, dressed but without his coat, and with pouting lips was breathing into his open hand. So he was not asleep, but he's fully dressed, and he's lying in bed without his coat. And without uttering a word, Nellie, when she sees him, she sits down and she begins to cry. And she weeps bitterly because she sees that the doctor is tired. She sees that the doctor is not well. But for herself, what matters is that her husband is ill. He has very high fever, and she has to take the doctor back in order for her husband to be treated. So she's weeping and she's crying, and she says, my husband is ill. And the doctor doesn't respond. He doesn't say anything at all. He gets up slowly. You know, it's an effort for him to get up. And when Nellie repeats that her husband is ill, he says, I cannot do anything. You know, he growls. He's so focused on his own breathing that he's not paying any attention to what Nellie is saying. So Nellie says, make haste, make haste. In other words, what she's saying is, don't waste time, please don't waste time. My husband needs us. He is very ill, and I have to take you back to him. Come this very minute. Oh, it's terrible to think, for mercy's sake. So she's pleading with him, she's begging him, and she's pale because she's been traveling, she's exhausted. because of the long distance that she has traveled, and she sees that whatever she is doing, whatever she is saying, it doesn't seem to be having any effect on the doctor. So she cries, she weeps, and she says, please come with me, please come with me. My husband is very, very ill. You have to come now. And she dares not say that if the doctor doesn't go with her, her husband will die. It's something that she doesn't want to express. And Chekhov says her sufferings would have touched the heart of a stone. But the doctor just looks at her, blows into his open hand, and that's it. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't try to get up. And then he says, I'll come tomorrow. And Nellie says, that's impossible. I know my husband has typhus. At once, this very minute, you are needed. And the doctor is very, very weak, and he says, I have only just come in. For the last 3 days I've been away seeing typhus patients, and I'm exhausted and ill myself. I simply can't. Absolutely, I've got it myself. So there, I have the typhus. So the doctor tries to convince Nellie that he's tired. He's been away for 3 days. Remember, he's the district doctor, so he's responsible for the entire district. Now, you're talking about the 19th century. You're talking about a time when there were no good roads. So traveling was a very, very tiring business, and a district doctor had to cover the entire district and had to look after all the patients who were living within the circumference, within the area of the district. So she pleads with him, she begs him, and what does the doctor do? He thrusts his thermometer in front of her face. So what does the doctor do? He thrusts the thermometer in front of her face so that she will see herself. And he says, my temperature is nearly 40. So this is 40. And he says, you know, I absolutely can't get up. I cannot sit up. You'll have to excuse me. I have to lie down. So although he makes an effort and he gets up, yet he can't sustain that effort and he lies down. And Nellie says, but I implore you, doctor, I beseech you, help me, for mercy's sake, make a great effort and come. I will repay you, doctor. And he says, oh dear, why, I've told you already, I cannot move, I can't sit up. But for Nellie, what is important is her husband. She doesn't care what the doctor feels like. She doesn't care if he's ill himself. He keeps on saying, I don't have the strength. I have the fever myself. I can't get up. But she keeps on saying, you have to come with me. You cannot say no to me. And then when she sees that the doctor has lain again, she gets up and she starts walking here and there within the room. She wants to explain to the doctor, to show him that there is a reason why she's acting like a madwoman, but the doctor will not understand. She wants him to forget his exhaustion. She wants him to go with her at once. But she doesn't know what words to use. She doesn't know how to make her speech so eloquent that the doctor will be moved and the doctor will accompany her at once to her house. Instead, the doctor says, go to the Zemstvo doctor. So he sends her somewhere else. And she says, that's impossible. He lives more than 20 miles from here and time is precious. Now you remember, this is the 19th century. 20 miles was a long distance then. Now you can say 20 miles is no distance at all. 20 miles is, let's say, one corner of Rawalpindi to another corner of Islamabad. So within the city you can say that you have traveled 20 miles. But in those days, when you did not have these modern means of communication, 20 miles was a long distance. And remember, Nelly is coming at night. So she says the time is precious, the horses can't take that distance. It is 30 miles from us to you, and the Zemstvo doctor is another 20 miles. And I just cannot cover that distance, you know, I just can't go. You have to go with me. Stepan Lukic, you have to help me out. I ask of you an heroic deed. I want you to be a hero. I want you to put your patients before yourself. So you have to get up and you have to have pity on us. And the doctor says, it's beyond everything. I'm in a fever. My head's in a whirl, and she won't understand. She won't leave me alone. And Nelly says, but you are duty bound to come. You know, you're the district doctor. You have to take care of patients. And my husband is ill, and you have to take care of him. And I can't travel further. And if you don't come with me now, I will take you to court. Imagine the kind of thing that she's saying. But you have to remember that she's nervous, she's tense, she's worried. She is unhappy, and in her unhappiness, in her nervousness, she doesn't know what she's saying. Just as the doctor in his fever does not know what he's saying. But when she says, I will summon you before the court, she is forgetting logic. She is forgetting her sympathy for other people and putting herself and her husband before and beyond everyone else. So when she starts saying these things, you have to come and I'll take you to court and it is your duty, all that he does is he drinks a little water. And when he hears her saying that she will take him to court, he tries to sit up. It's very difficult. It takes a lot of energy, a lot of strength. But he sits up because she is begging him. There is no difference between her and one of the beggars you see outside on the street who say, please give me 5 rupees, please give me 10 rupees. I have not eaten for 5 days and please buy something for me. So Nelly is reduced to the position of the lowliest beggar because she's so tense, because she's so upset. She is not using her logic, she's not using her reason, but to justify her action, she is so upset that when she compares her husband's illness with the doctor's illness, her husband's illness seems far worse to her, and therefore she begs the doctor, she implores the doctor to go with her, and at last the doctor relents to the extent that he tries to sit up. So she helps him to sit up, and then he's looking around for his coat. Remember, the doctor is fully dressed. He was lying in bed fully dressed because he had just come back home after spending 3 days taking care of many different patients in different parts of the district. And when he comes back home, he finds that he is faced with Nelly, who will not take no for an answer. So he gets up and she helps him to put on his coat, and all the time she says, come along, I will repay you. So as soon as she sees that the doctor is trying to make an effort to get up, she changes her technique from begging and pleading and showing her anger and saying that she will take him to court. She changes totally and she becomes very helpful for the doctor. She helps him with his coat, and then she says, you know, I will not forget this. I will repay you. So she changes her tactics radically and becomes very sympathetic, becomes very helpful to the doctor, because she realizes that the doctor really is feverish. It is because he's feverish, because he has been working for 3 days and 3 nights non-stop, because he has been exposed to the fever. Once he has put on his coat, he lies down again because he just does not have that strength left in his body. So putting on that coat tires him out and he lies down again. And then Nellie had to worry about his boots because it's cold outside, it's snowing, and you know that Russia gets a lot of snow. So in that in that place at that time of the night, in that region where you have a lot of snow, you need to be properly warmly dressed up. So she puts on his coat, she helps him put on his boots and then his overcoat. So the one layer is not enough, and she helps him in everything. And then, you know, they find out that the cap is lost. So then she goes looking for the cap. She finds the cap because they can't go out without a cap. It's so cold outside. And then she helps him into the carriage. She helps the doctor get into the carriage because by now she realizes that the doctor really is not well, and whatever he had been saying about his illness and his exposure to the typhus fever, she sees that that is true. He was not lying, he's telling the truth, and he really does not have the strength. So once the doctor is in the carriage, they start traveling back towards Nellie's house. They had only 30 miles to go, but 30 miles at night time is a long distance. It's a long distance not just because it is dark, but also because the path is a very stony one. It's uneven ground. The terrain is such that they have to be very careful. Remember, these are the times before you had the locomotive and the automobile. This is the time when people are still traveling in carriages. So once the doctor has been helped into the carriage, Nellie gives orders to the coachman to drive, and while they drive, it's a very bumpy road, and they're traveling non-stop because she wants to get the doctor as quickly as possible to her husband, who is very, very ill. And she thinks that he has the typhus also. Now, you also need to remember that in the 19th century, there were many diseases which were considered fatal. And one of the major reasons is that you did not have the antibiotics that we have nowadays. So these antibiotics, these wonder drugs, were not available, and a very small illness could lead to your death. For example, influenza, the influenza virus could lead to your death. Something like the typhus could lead to your death. Now you have vaccines that have been developed against these diseases. You have antibiotics that have been developed and that are available in the market, so that when you have an infection, you go to the doctor says, okay, take these medicines and you will be all right. But we're talking about the 19th century. We're talking about a time when there were no automobiles. There was a big problem in communication and transportation, and also you did not have the modern medicines that you have now. You had no antibiotics, you had no steroids. So a lot of people died when they fell ill, and these illnesses would be prolonged. So when Nellie and the doctor start off for Nellie's home, Chekhov says the earth was wrapped in darkness. One could not see one's hand before one's face. So deep is the darkness that it's very difficult for them to see where they are going, and that is why again and again the coachman has to stop and see which road he's going to take. Whenever there is a split in the road, it's so dark that the coachman cannot decide which road to take, so he gets down. He follows the path for some time on foot, and he sees where the road is leading, and then he comes back and drives the carriage onto that portion of the land. So they sit silent. You see, there's nothing to discuss. Nellie was talking only as long as there was the need to convince the doctor. Once the doctor is convinced, Nellie is exhausted, and all she can do is just sit back and wait for the carriage to reach her home. It was fearfully jolting, but they felt neither the cold nor the jolts. Nellie doesn't feel the cold or the jolts because there's a turmoil in Nellie's mind. There's confusion and chaos in Nellie's mind, and as far as the doctor is concerned, his fever is so high that he doesn't feel any of the jolts. When the carriage goes over, let's say, a rock or a stone, there's a huge jolt, but neither of the passengers feel it. And Nellie implores the driver to go faster. Now the get on here means go faster. The driver says, I can't go faster. It is night time. Visibility is poor. The terrain is very rocky and stony, so he cannot go at a faster pace. And it is at 5 o'clock in the morning that Nellie and the doctor finally drive into the yard, or the area where you had the stables. Nellie saw the familiar gates, the well with the crane, the long row of stables and barns. At last she was at home. So a little peace descends onto Nellie when she gets home, because everything is familiar. And she says, she takes him inside, she takes the doctor inside, and she says, wait a moment, I'll be back directly. So she goes up to her husband, and when she comes back from seeing her husband, she sees that the doctor is lying down. He's lying down and he's muttering. And Nellie says, oh doctor, please, 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 do not lose consciousness at this time. And the doctor says, ask Damna. And Nellie says, what? The doctor said, they said at the meeting, Vlasov said, who, what? And Nellie realizes that the doctor was as delirious as her husband. The doctor's fever is the same as that of her husband. And when the doctor just falls down on the sofa, that is an indication that nothing can be done for her husband right now. And that is when she makes the decision that she's going to go to the Zemstvo doctor. Then again there followed darkness, a cutting cold wind, lumps of frozen earth. So 5 o'clock in the morning she leaves again. Now you have to remember that 5 o'clock is not 5 o'clock in the summers in Pakistan when you have broad daylight, but this is 5 o'clock in Russia when it is still dark. So in darkness she sets out again without a pause, without resting. She sets off for this other doctor whom the district doctor had already recommended. She was suffering in body and in soul, and delusive nature has no arts, no deceptions to compensate these sufferings. Then she saw against the grey background how her husband every spring was in straits for money to pay the interest for the mortgage to the bank. So slowly the scene shifts, and from her husband and her husband's doctor, she sees other times. She sees how difficult it is for her husband to meet expenses, and she thinks about other times. She thinks about times when neither of them can sleep. Both think and think and think on how they're going to make ends meet. There's this mortgage on the house, they have to make payments, there's no money coming in, so it's very, very upsetting. And this is what they keep on thinking about. She sees her children and she visualizes them as getting colds or influenza or scarlet fever or diphtheria or even bad marks at school, separation. You know, she sees all that happening, and she doesn't know what to do, because one thing that she knows for sure is that all the children will not survive to adulthood or to maturity because of these heavily compromised situation, where out of 5 or 6 children, 1 will die for sure. That's something that was usual in within a family in the 19th century, and Chekhov, being a representative of the 19th century, is writing about the problems occurring at that time, the issues facing the people in the second half of the 19th century. The grey background was not untouched by death. Now you're talking about the grey background that seemed to have disappeared, and Nellie senses death. A husband and wife cannot die simultaneously. Of course, if they're involved in a crash, that's different. Otherwise, they will not die simultaneously. Whatever happened, one must bury the other. And Nellie, because she is the central protagonist, Nellie survives her husband, Nellie buries her husband, and she sees everything in such detail. She remembers and she recalls everything in such detail that she can see she can see the deacon, she can see the footmarks in the hall made by the undertaker. She sees the presence of the undertaker, which is, in other words, the presence of death in the house. And she sees her husband dead, and she says, why is it? What is it for? And she's totally blank. because it has come as such a big shock for her. And when she imagines this situation, she also realizes that the previous life with her husband, when she compares it to the time when he is no more, all those years seem to be just a stupid prelude to the actual fact of life, and that is death. So according to her, there's only one reality that they are facing, and that is death. Now, when she gets to this point, she's very depressed. She's very upset. And at this point, something falls from her hand and knocks on the floor. She's shocked. She jumps up and she opens her eyes wide. One looking glass she saw lying at her feet. The other was standing as before on the table. She looked into the looking glass and saw a pale, tear-stained face. There was no grey background now. I must have fallen asleep, she thought with a sigh of relief. So the climax that Chekhov builds up to, the very important point that he leads his argument towards, is that all through this time, Nellie has been looking at a mirror. None of the things that she outlines has happened. There is no destined man. There is no face with a beard. There are no mortgages. There are no worries. There is nothing. She has been looking at a mirror, seeing herself, seeing a reflection of herself, and it is from that she builds up this imaginary future. Remember when I pointed out at the very beginning that this is universal story? All those girls who are either waiting to be married or have just passed the stage where they can get married, this is something that is very significant. It shows you the reality that has to be faced. Life is not easy. Life is full of troubles. Life is full of troubles on a domestic level. Life is full of troubles on an international level. So it's not easy to imagine a life that Nellie would be leading with a husband. So she looks into this mirror and she realizes that whatever she had imagined had been in her imagination only. None of that had happened. There'd been no man, there'd been no husband, and therefore there was no illness, there was no typhus, there was no district doctor who would come back with her and look after her. She has been daydreaming. And this is a dream that takes the character of Nellie and universalizes her. This is a character that you can take from this story transport it to Pakistan or India and have her imagining everything that happened, you can just change the context and the story will remain the same. It is the story of all those girls who want to get married, but for some reason they are not yet married. They are at the stage where girls are getting married, and yet somehow they do not get married. And this is a dilemma that is very true of girls in Pakistan particularly. They come from good families, they are educated, and yet you do not find any what you would call rishtas for them. You know, there are no rishtas coming in, there are no proposals for them, and so they spend their lives just waiting. You remember when we were doing the short story, The Trousseau? You had Manechka weaving her trousseau, stitching, embroidering, making clothes for her trousseau. She dies, but she doesn't get married. And her mother still continues to make clothes for her, because she is fixed in the past. She is fixed at a time when her daughter was still young enough and beautiful enough to get married. So you can read this story, The Looking Glass, as a sort of sister story, as a parallel story to Chekhov's story, The Trousseau. There also he's talking about girls waiting to get married, daydreaming about marriage, making preparations for marriage, and at the end of the story you find out that you die but you don't get married. So this is something that universalizes this story, the character of Nellie, etc., etc. So before I break off for today, let me quickly go over some of the points that we have discussed today. The story that we discussed in this lecture is titled The Looking Glass, and it is by the Russian short story writer Anton Chekhov. We have had a couple of stories by Anton Chekhov, and we have gathered an impression of the Chekhovian style of story writing. And one of the things that you will have noticed in these stories is that he builds up the suspense, he builds up the mystery, and then right at the end he provides for you the climax. So it's rising action all the way, and then you have the climax. Unlike a drama, you don't have falling action, or you don't have descending action, as it is termed in drama. So Chekhov, writing dramas and writing short stories, is one of the most prominent short story writers of the time. He was writing in the 19th century. He was writing at a time when there was no contribution in the genre of short story writing from writers in England. And you know that after Sir Walter Scott launched the short story, the work was done either on the continent or it was across the ocean in America. So Chekhov, writing in the 19th century, deals with certain issues that are universal. He deals with ideas that can occur at any point in time, anywhere in the world. Although he uses specifically Russian names, that's because those are the names that he is most familiar with. And it's not to say that you cannot substitute the name of a Russian individual and write, let's say, a Pakistani name for him. The context stays the same. You can transport those characters, you can bring them to Pakistan, and it will seem as if those characters are a production of the Pakistani system, where you have girls who wait well into their 20s and 30s and sometimes even 40s, and yet they believe that one day they will get married, a handsome man will come and he will take them away from this place, from their home, and you will live happily ever after. So these are the ideas that go through the minds of the majority of young girls. And Nellie, who is the central character of the short story The Looking Glass, is one such character. She's pretty, she's young, she comes from a good family background in the sense that her father is not only a landowner, but he is also a general. And at the same time, Nellie is unable to find a match for herself. So she's sitting there looking at the mirror and trying to see what the reasons are why she cannot get married. She looks at herself, she sees her face, her hair, her general health, and there's nothing wrong with her. She looks into her background is acceptable. But what she cannot prevent is looking into this mirror and imagining her future as a married woman. And this is where Chekhov's beauty of style comes in, because the kinds of things that she imagines, it would be very difficult for a common individual to imagine all of that in one go. She not only imagines a face for her husband, but soon that face develops into a figure. She imagines that she is married to him. Now, nothing of the sort has happened. It's all in her imagination. It's all in her mind. So she imagines that she is married, that she has children, that she has all the concerns of a married woman. And that includes typhus breaking out, her husband falling ill, Nellie going to the doctor to beg for health and medication, and the doctor saying that, you know, he doesn't have the strength. He's just come back after 3 days of seeing typhus patients, so his brains are all scrambled up. But Nellie also sees herself sort of fighting the doctor and the system to get help as soon as possible for her husband. So she drags him from his house, and she forces him to travel with her in her carriage. She makes the driver drive fast, and what that does is that it reduces the time that you spend in your journey, but it makes it all the more uncomfortable because you do not have the time to look at stones and rocks in your path. You assume that your path is bare, is empty, and yet when you ride onto it, you realize that this is something that is not an easy task. So finally, when they reach home, Nellie gets the doctor to sit in the sofa in the dining room, and she goes up to see if she can bring the doctor over, or if the doctor will come down and examine the patient. So she leaves the doctor there, and she goes up to see her husband, and when she comes back she sees that the doctor is as delirious as her husband, and that whatever she says, he comes up with something different, and so whatever the doctor or whatever her husband are saying is that this cannot happen. You know, they're both delirious, and all that the doctor can say is that you need to go to the Zemstvo doctor. So Nellie lets him lie there, and she gets into her carriage again, and she starts traveling through the night again. Now, if you think of, let's say, December mornings, 5 o'clock will not be very dark. You go on into the summer, and 5 in the evening you will have a very strong sun, and these things keep on changing, but you do know that the country that's been mentioned again and again, and that is Russia, there's very little daylight. So 5 o'clock in the morning is dark, 5 o'clock in the evening it is still dark. And so she sees herself going for the Zemstvo doctor, bringing him back, and the doctor telling her that there's nothing they can do for her husband. He dies, and she goes through that ritual of having the coffin prepared, of getting in a good undertaker. She sees all those minute details, and that reflects the powers of her imagination. Remember, all this is taking place solely in an imaginary world. None of it has anything to do with reality. It's something that cannot be explained until it is experienced. So the reality hits home when she sees what a difficult life her husband has led, how far she has been facilitated. So what the bottom line is that she hears the sound of something falling, and she looks down to see that one of the mirrors is on the floor, the other mirror is in front of her, and she's sitting at her table. So she realizes that throughout all this she had been dreaming. She'd gone off to sleep, and she doesn't realize that she has gone off to sleep, and she goes and she sees everything, and when she wakes up she is relieved. She is relieved because she may not be married, but she is not at the stage where she will lead, where she will go away, or where she will bury her husband, and where she'll have so many problems. So right now, maybe the problem that is occupying all her attention is the fact that she's not married yet. But when she imagines everything that's going to happen to her once she does get married, it is with a sigh of relief that she realizes that she is in a very, very good position, and that this position is preferable to a position where she does get married but she ends up burying her husband after a long life that she has spent in suffering and in seeing suffering. So I think that's enough for today. I'll be seeing you soon, inshallah. Thank you very much for being patient, and Allah Hafiz.